Hello, everybody. I am Natasha Lester, the author of The Riviera House, which was out today, which is very exciting. I am just going to do that usual thing where I talk for a couple of minutes while I wait for everybody to start joining the live stream. So welcome to those of you who have already joined. Looking forward to chatting to everyone here tonight on Facebook. Thank you very much to Better Reading for inviting me to come along and talk about the Riviera House. I am sitting here in my office. This is where the books all get written. This is my big wall of books behind me, which was probably one of the first things I designed when we started building the house. It's very important to be surrounded by books when you're a writer. Hi, Tracy. Lovely to have you here. I'm glad that someone's here. I was worried I was going to be here by myself. It's always nice to have some viewers join in. So thank you to everybody who has joined. I'll just give it a few more seconds to get everybody else joining the live stream before I start talking about the Riviera House. Thank you, Gail, for saying that you love my books. That's always music to an author's ears. Hi, Linda. Lovely to have you on as well. And Christy, I can see lots of familiar faces, which is very nice to have some friends around while I talk about the Riviera House. So thank you to everyone who is joining the live stream. I probably will kick off. Hi, Anne. Lovely to have you. I'm talking to you from Perth in Western Australia. So it's actually freezing cold here tonight. So I've got my Ugg boots on underneath my dress, which is always a good look. But that's why we love live streams, because nobody knows what we're doing, except I've just told you. Hi, Diane. Lovely to have you here too. I hope your book arrives soon too. I know there's been some delays in some people getting their books out to them, but obviously with the pandemic, that's been a problem. So happy. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Yes, Tracy's waiting on hers too. I'm so sorry. Hopefully they do all arrive soon and you enjoy reading them once you get your hands on them. So lovely to have. Hi, Cindy. Thank you so much for your beautiful review, Cindy. It was lovely to read that this morning on publication day. Authors love to have reviews that are good and positive to make us feel better. So let's kick off with starting to talk about the Riviera House, which is my book that's out today. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through, because as anyone who has seen me talk before, I can easily talk for a couple of hours, but I would much rather answer specific questions that you have. So please just pop those into the comments. So the Riviera House, just to quickly give you a bit of a snapshot of what the book's about, so some of the things that I talk about make some sense. It's about a young woman called Eliane Dufour who works for the Louvre in Paris just before the Second World War. And then once Paris is occupied by the Nazis, she's forced to leave her position at the Louvre and she's moved to a different Parisian museum, one called the Jeu de Paume. And on her first day at work, as she approaches the museum, she sees that it's surrounded by armed Nazis, and she has no idea why an art museum would need to be guarded by armed soldiers. And then she walks into the museum and she sees all around her the most astonishing collection of artwork she's ever seen. So much artwork that it would be more than one of the best museums in the world could possibly gather together for an exhibition. She has no idea why the art is there, and she decides to find out what is happening to this artwork. And that starts her mission to work with the French resistance to spy on the Nazis who are thieving all of the artworks owned by the Jewish families of Paris. So that is in a nutshell what the book is about. There's a few different elements that I thought I would start talking about tonight. Firstly, the Nazi art thefts during the Second World War. I know that's something that not everybody knows about. So I was inspired to write the book by three things, I suppose. And the first of those was a woman called Rose Velon, who worked in the Jeu de Paume Museum, where part of the book is set during the Second World War in real life. And Rose was the curator of the museum. When the Nazis occupied Paris, they demoted her to caretaker, and they made sure she didn't speak German, and she told them that she didn't, but she actually did. And so once she realised what was happening, that this museum was being used as a transit facility for the Nazis to steal all of the artworks owned by the Jewish families of Paris and of France, she decided that somebody had to record what the Nazis were doing, because she hoped that at some time in the future, Paris would be liberated and there would be the opportunity to restore these artworks to their rightful owners. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring were both avaricious art collectors and they had already seized art collections through all of the other countries that they had occupied. And she could see that that was happening again. She actually, in her memoir, called the Jeu de Paume Museum a concentration camp for artworks, because that was kind of what it was like. These artworks were stolen from families, imprisoned in the Jeu de Paume. They were catalogued by art historians, and then they were sent on Hermann Göring's private train to different locations in Germany and Austria to be hidden and safeguarded until the end of the war, when Hitler decided he would display them in his Führer Museum and Hermann Göring decided he would display them in his private home Carinal. So Rose, at great risk to her life, recorded all of the details of the Nazis thieving, what artworks arrived at the museums, who they were stolen from, and where they were going. They were stored at places like Neuschwanstein, that fairy tale castle that the Cinderella castle in Disneyland is based upon, and in the salt mines at Altersee, and all kinds of places like that. She was fired from the museum 4 times during the Second World War because the Nazis became suspicious of what she was doing. But each time she would just reappear a couple of weeks later, and she kind of played this role of being a quiet, demure, mouse-like woman who everybody overlooked and nobody knew what she was doing. Colonel von Boer, who ran the art thieving organization that the Nazis had set up, he threatened her at one stage with taking her to the German border and liquidating her. So it was really dangerous work, but she kept doing it because it was so important to her. I was really fascinated by the idea of a woman risking her life to save artworks. So I decided to write The Riviera House to explore a bit more about Rose Velon and what that must have been like to witness that during the war. So my character, Eliane Dufour, works with Rose at the Jeu de Paume to spy on the Nazis. So there's a number of other elements to the story, which I will talk a little bit about. I can see lots of questions coming in, which is lovely, which I will definitely answer. So there's a couple more elements to the story. One of those is you may have heard of the evacuation of the Louvre at the start of the Second World War. All of the artworks, or almost all of the artworks at the world's famous Louvre Museum were actually packed up in crates and boxes and rolled up in wooden tubes and sent away to the French countryside for safekeeping. So the Mona Lisa was one of those artworks that was moved on an ambulance stretcher in her own specially designed poplar crate with red velvet lining. And she was moved around the French countryside for years, trying to keep her safe. At one point, she was moved between 2 different chateaux because one had become too humid for her, and she was put in a hermetically sealed van to stop her from getting damaged as the Mona Lisa was moved. And the art curator sitting in the van with the Mona Lisa arrived at the new chateau unconscious because there was no oxygen in the back of the van. And I just thought, my goodness, it was so extraordinary how much these curators put their lives on the line to protect these pieces that we can now obviously, well, not at the moment go and see at the Louvre because nobody can travel, but ordinarily we can go and see at the Louvre. And, you know, who knew that the Mona Lisa had such adventures during the Second World War? She also was sent out of the Louvre Museum with a code on the back of her so that the real Mona Lisa could always be identified by the Louvre curators and the Louvre, the people who worked at the Louvre. And I was quite fascinated by that idea of the code. It was in 2 parts. Monsieur Jacques Jaujard of the Musée National wrote part of the code on the Mona Lisa when she left the Louvre, and then Pierre Schormer, who received her at the Chateau de Chambord in the Loire Valley, wrote the second part of the code onto her. And so that idea of a code in 2 parts, I loved it so much that I used that in the Riviera House as well. And that's part of the kind of mystery at the center of the story. So you'll have to read the book to find out how that comes into play. Of course, with a book called The Riviera House, there is also a Riviera storyline there. There's a contemporary narrative in this book too. If you've read my books in the past, you know I like to weave together past and present. And the contemporary storyline unfolds on this beautiful house on the French Riviera. If you want to know the real life house that was based upon, go and have a look at my website or my Facebook page. I've got lots of photos there. Because I did travel to the French Riviera to research the book. I was lucky that I was researching this back in 2018, so when travel was still a possibility. And I knew I wanted to write about a house on the Riviera. I'd read a book called The Riviera Set by Mary Lovell, and it was about an actress's house in the French Riviera, a real house that had been the scene of parties over the 1920s and 1930s. And I loved the idea of this house harboring all these people and having this kind of legacy. The house is still there. So I decided I would, make my narrative be based partly around this grand mansion on the Riviera, where a party plays a really central role, a party that happens in the Second World War. So I drove in and out of dozens of little towns on the French Riviera trying to find the exact right town for my Riviera house. And it wasn't until I drove into a town called Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat that I knew I'd found the perfect town. I'd gone to Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat to look at a house called the Villa of Frasier Rothschild. This beautiful pink house right on top of the hill, surrounded by water, with these amazing gardens. It has a rose garden, a lapidary garden, a Japanese garden, a sculpture garden. Just, it's beautiful. And the house is amazing. It's quite stunning. And I knew that I had found my perfect house. It was the inspiration for the house in the Riviera House. So definitely have a look at those photographs, because everything you'll read about the house in the Riviera House, you'll be able to see reflected in the Villa of Frasier Rothschild. It really was quite the inspiring location. So I will answer a few questions now. I think I can talk about lots of other things as well, and I'll just jump in and add more things on in between answering your questions, because I don't want to get to the end and have talked so much I've forgotten to answer people's questions. I did see a couple pop up here. Excuse me while I scroll through. Marg says she received a preview copy. I'm glad that you enjoyed the preview copy. Thank you so much. Oh, hang on a sec. Sorry. I'm just scrolling down to get the questions. Here we go. Susan McDonald has asked, did I need permission to use Rose Velon's story or elements such as the recordings of the artwork? Great question. Often when people, Rose has sadly passed away, and so there was no one to ask permission of. But as a historical fiction novelist, it's really important to me to try to stick to the truth as much as possible. So for me, that meant reading Rose Valon's memoir. She published her memoir after the Second World War. Unfortunately, there's no English translation of her memoir. It was only published in French. Luckily, I speak French, but it's still quite a chore for me to read an entire book in French. So I read through that one chapter a day, to sort of get an idea of Rose's character and exactly what happened at the Jeu de Paume. Also, the Musée National Archives in Paris have all of Rose's original notebooks, the notebooks she recorded the details of the stolen paintings in, stored in the archive there. So I was able to go and sit through and look through all of Rose's handwritten journal entries, recording the details of the stolen paintings. There was a room at the Jeu de Paume that Rose called the Salle des Martyrs, or the Room of the Martyrs, because the Nazis considered certain types of art to be degenerate. Most of the modernist artwork, so impressionist art like Picasso's and Matisse's and Van Gogh's and Monet's and Manet's. And whenever those paintings arrived at the Jeu de Paume, they had Rose move them to the Room of the Martyrs, and they were kept there away from all the other artworks that the Nazis believed was superior. And so you can see in her notebooks these lists that she's written of the paintings that were kept in the Room of the Martyrs and that were occasionally taken out by Hermann Göring to be traded for other paintings that he wanted to own by artists that he considered to be non-degenerate. So no, there was no need to get anyone's permission to write about Rose. But as I say, for me, it was more about making sure I stayed true as much as I could to Rose's story and to what happened to her. Of course, you are writing fiction, so you are making things up. I'm giving her dialogue. I have no way of knowing what exact words she did speak, obviously, at the time, but I use as much fact as I possibly can to shape my fiction around. And archives are wonderful because that's the way to get to those primary source materials that help you to be able to write the best possible book. book. So I was very lucky to be able to do that. I actually travelled to Paris and visited the Jeu de Paume Museum in 2018. And I had with me an old, because the interior of the museum is very different now. The exterior is still exactly the same. And I had an old map from the Second World War showing where all the different galleries were at that time. And I could see on this map where the Salle des Martyrs was. So I went and stood in that part of the museum, and I don't know whether it's just my overactive imagination as a writer, but to me that space felt haunted. You could still feel that something bad had happened there. So it was quite a moving experience. And also standing there, like you can see on a map that the Jeu de Paume must look out over the Eiffel Tower, as so many buildings in Paris do. But it's not until you stand in the museum, and there are some beautiful arched windows along one side of the museum. And through one arched window, the sun was setting when I was there, and you could see the Eiffel Tower backdropped by this amazing golden orange sunset. And for me, that was a really pivotal moment to imagine what it must have been like to be Rose Velon, standing in that window, looking out at this iconic symbol of Paris, the Eiffel Tower, but knowing she had a Nazi at her back and that everything she did could get her killed at any time. So that was, again, quite a shiver down my backbone kind of moment, I suppose, in terms of researching her story. So thank you very much for your question, Susan. Sorry, I just went off on lots of tangents there, as I tend to do, but great question. Let me have a look. There's a couple of other questions here. Tracy's saying that she hasn't read about the art thefts during the Second World War before. No, I think that, and also Tracy said, I believe not all the art has been found yet. No, that's absolutely right. And that was another thing that attracted me to this story, because in 2015, Hermann Göring's art catalogue was actually published, and that catalogue plays a role in the Riviera House. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of the artwork that was taken to the Jeu de Paume was hand-selected by Göring, who visited the museum 24 times over the course of the Second World War to choose paintings from all the different collections there, paintings that he had no right to choose and to take, to enrich his own private collection. And he had his own art historians create a catalogue of everything that he had taken, detailing the name of the painting, the name of the artist. There was a photograph of each of the artworks in this catalogue. And Rose Valland came by this catalogue sometime after the war. People think it was around 1946, but no one's exactly sure. She was involved in the art restitution efforts after the war. And, you know, without Rose, it's likely that, you know, hundreds of thousands of paintings would still be missing rather than thousands of paintings that are still missing. And so she came across Hermann Göring's catalogue, but she kept it a secret. She never showed it to anybody. And it wasn't until near her death, she packaged up all of her papers and put them in boxes and sent them to the National Archives, where they languished. Nobody looked through her papers until sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, her boxes were opened. And in the boxes was discovered Hermann Göring's art catalogue of everything he'd stolen during the Second World War. And the idea that Rose had, you know, worked so hard to restore the artworks to their rightful owners after the war, but had kept this catalogue a secret, just really struck me. And I don't know why she did. Nobody knows why she did. And that catalogue plays a role in the story and the idea behind why she kept it a secret. I have, of course, as a fiction writer, used my imagination to create a reason for why perhaps she might have felt the need to hide that catalogue away. And the main character in my contemporary storyline discovers the catalogue once it's been published in 2015, as I mentioned that it was. And she finds in that catalogue a painting that has always hung on her childhood bedroom wall in Sydney. And she has no idea how a painting that she owns could have been stolen from somebody back in the Second World War. And so she decides to find that out. But yes, Tracy, not all of the art has been restituted to its rightful owners. In fact, almost monthly, there are articles in the newspapers about a painting that has been discovered that was stolen during the Second World War. Often they turn up at auction houses, and there's a lot of work these days to try to prove the provenance of those paintings and to return them to the families of the people that they were stolen from. But some of these artworks have been hidden, for decades, literally since the Second World War. So sometimes it's quite challenging, but many families are still missing paintings today. So it's a story that has a lot of contemporary resonance as these artworks turn up year after year. Some were recently discovered in a Swiss bank vault, for instance. So, and who knows where the rest of the pieces are that are still missing. Linda has asked me how long it took me to research this book before I started to write it. That's a very good question also, Linda. Basically, I don't do a lot of research before I start writing the book. For me, because I'm the kind of writer who struggles with planning a book up front, I actually need to write a first draft to know what I'm doing. And so that means that I'll read a book that gives me a broad overview of the topic I'm writing about. So, for instance, whilst I was writing the first draft of the Riviera House, I read a book by Lynn Nichols called The Rape of Europa, which is about all of the art thefts across Europe during the Second World War, because it wasn't just France where the Nazis were stealing paintings. And so that gave me some background to the subject, and she talks about Rose and Hermann Göring and the Jeu de Paume in that book. And so from those kind of scant facts, I just let my imagination run wild, throw my characters into the story, see what they're going to do, try to make all these connections between the other things that fascinate me, like the evacuation of artworks from the Louvre, the Hermann Göring catalogue, the stolen paintings, etc. And then once I get to the end of this first draft, what I have is a very rough, loose draft with lots of holes and lots of gaps, but it means now I know what I need to research. That draft acts as my research blueprint, I suppose you could say. So then I go and do a solid month of research. And that's when I always go and travel to the places and locations in my book. So that meant going to the Louvre and looking at some of those paintings, like Vermeer's Astronomer is now hanging in the Louvre. And that was owned by Edouard de Rothschild during the Second World War. And it was one of the paintings that the Nazis stole and took to the Jeu de Paume Museum and was then sent to the to Neuschwanstein in order to be used in Hitler's Führer Museum after the war, once he had planned to build that. But, you can go and see that painting hanging on the wall of the Louvre, and nobody knows the history behind that painting, that it was stolen. It was sitting in this, concentration camp for artworks, as Rose called it. And then that languished, in this castle for so many years. And then thanks to Rose, who joined in the efforts of the Allied Art Looting Investigation Unit, it was then tracked down and then restored to the Rothschild family, who then donated it back to the Louvre. So that was, quite a wonderful story. And I, as soon as I kind of read all of that, I knew I had to include that as part of the story. So they're the kinds of things that you find when you're researching. You travel to the Louvre. I traveled to the Jeu de Paume. I traveled down to the French Riviera. I sat in the Musée National Archives in Paris, and also the archives in Washington, because a lot of the papers to do with the art looting are held in Washington. In fact, just for an extra challenge, the papers to do with the art thefts during the Second World War are kept in 35 different archives spread over 12 different countries. So it's there's a mammoth amount of paperwork there. And, you want to feel as a researcher that you've done the research, but of course it's not possible to go to 35 different archives in 12 different countries. So for me, it was a matter of selecting the 2 archives that I felt had the most resonance to my book, and doing that in that month of solid research that I do. And then once I've done that solid month of research, it's then rewriting the book with all of that research material in mind, a number of times, not just once. And then as I rewrite a number of times, continuing to read more and do more research to go back through all the archival material that I've unearthed and that sort of thing. So it's an ongoing research process over the course of the whole year that I'm writing the book, with a really solid, focused month of research in the middle of that, I suppose. So Joy Bell has asked me where I get my inspiration from. For me, it's always when I'm reading the research material for the previous book, I'll come across some facts that really fascinate me and capture my attention and that I want to write about, but that I can't fit into the book I'm currently writing. So, for instance, when I was writing The Paris Secret, which was the book of mine that came out last year, I came across Rose Velon and her story, and I knew straight away that that was something I wanted to write about. And so I made a note of that and then decided to write the Riviera House based around that story. So for me, it's always, in my research material, there are so many stories of women who did remarkable, brave, courageous things during the Second World War. And so many of those women's stories have not been told or recorded. They've been forgotten by history. And so every time I come across one of those stories, that's the kind of thing that sparks all of my creative antenna. And I want to write those kinds of stories. So luckily for me, there are lots of those women, sadly for those women, that they have not been remembered and recognised. And I guess that's part of why I do this, is to try to bring them back to people's notice. And I love it when readers write to me and say, after I read The Paris Secret, for instance, I went and researched Catherine Dior because I was so fascinated to hear about her. I'd never heard about her before. So hopefully people do the same thing with this book and they go and spend some time researching Rose Velon, who was also another incredible woman. So let's have a look at what else. Susan McDonald has asked, is it tricky to combine a real life character with fictional ones? I actually really enjoy doing that. It's not always the case that real people's lives unfold in a perfect narrative arc with, conflict and complications and a climax at exactly the right moment. So for me, it gives me a bit more flexibility with the narrative and the narrative tension if I can introduce fictional characters in around that real person. The only time it does become tricky is it often means when you're writing fiction, and most historical novelists will say this, that you sometimes have to compress dates, and something that might have happened over 3 months, you might have to compress into 1 month, just because you can't have the book go on for 600 pages. Otherwise it becomes too long. So those are the only real challenges, but actually I really enjoy the challenges of combining those two elements in there. Kim Smith has asked, what do I do differently to research now that I can't travel? Yes, I'm looking forward to being able to travel once again when the borders reopen. I'm fully vaccinated, so ready to go anytime that I can. So for me, it's been a remarkable year of really, I've always known archivists were incredible people, but lockdown has made archivists just even more incredible. For instance, the book I've been researching that's being published next year, I needed to access some archival material, some letters that were kept in an archive in the US and one in the UK. And I also needed access to Diana Vreeland's papers, the famous fashion editor, that are kept at the Met Museum. So I got in touch with the archivists at each of those 3 places and told them what I was looking for, gave them the catalogue number of the records that I was after. And because nobody can access those archives in person, all of those archivists scanned in all the documents that I needed and emailed them across to me, which was just wonderful. And, pre-COVID, you had to go and travel to the archives. You couldn't access those papers that weren't digitized in that way. But it has been wonderful to see how helpful and wonderful people are at being able to keep historical novelists writing and researching, even within the constraints. Luckily, the book I'm writing for next year, it's set in France, Switzerland and Italy, 3 places I've travelled through extensively, and all the towns and cities are places I've been to. So I was able to draw on all of that previous knowledge to write those, which was great. What have I got here? A question from Kylie saying, hi, Natasha, what inspired you to become an author? I've always wanted to be an author. My mum has all these books that I wrote when I was young. I used to write stories. I used to illustrate them. I used to staple them together, and that was my fun. So I always knew it was something I wanted to do. It's not always easy to just be a writer. When I left university, there were no creative writing degrees, so I couldn't just be a writer. I went and worked in marketing for 10 years first, and then I came back to study creative writing later in my 30s and started writing. For me, I read a lot as a child, and I loved the way that I felt whenever I was just lost in the world of a book. And I wondered what it would feel like to be able to recreate that for other people, to write a story that readers truly felt that they were lost in and so immersed in. So that's what really has driven me to become a writer. It's always something I was planning to do, I suppose. couple of people have mentioned in the comments that The Monuments Men is a movie based around the art thefts in France during the Second World War, and you're right. Kate Blanchett plays a character who is very loosely based on Rose Valland. I wouldn't necessarily use the interpretation of Rose Valland in the movie as actual fact. Kate Blanchett is a wonderful actress, but I think that there was some creative license in the script there, but it's still a great movie as well. Let's have a look at what other questions we have here that I might have missed. Oh, sorry, I'm just scrolling through and finding. Someone's asked me, Remy's wardrobe in the Riviera House, is it my dream wardrobe? And this sounds like it'll be a good question to end up on because it's one of my favorite subjects, fashion. So Remy is the main character in the contemporary storyline of the book, and she has gone to the French Riviera to escape a personal tragedy and also to shoot a lookbook for her vintage fashion business. And so as part of that storyline, she is getting out of boxes all these amazing vintage fashion pieces that she's photographing to then sell to her customers. So there are gowns from Vianney and Lanvin and Pucci palazzo pajamas and Cole of California 1950s swimsuits and all kinds of amazing outfits. So yes, great reads and tea leaves. That is my dream wardrobe. That's one of the wonderful things about being a fiction writer. Anything you want to do, you can in a novel. I've written about fashion conservators, fashion curators, now a vintage fashion collector, because those are all the things that I would love to do if I wasn't actually a writer. So I get to explore all of those professions vicariously through my novels. So if you do like a bit of fashion, with your historical fiction, there is a bit of a fashionable storyline in there too. Now, as I say, I could actually talk for a very long time about this book. I've hardly scratched the surface of all of the things, but I know I only have half an hour. So thank you so much to everybody who's joined me. I can see so many familiar faces here. Hi, Bianca. Lovely to see you here. And Carol as well. And Carol and Ansky, thank you for joining me. Wonderful to have you. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening. I hope that if you do read the Riviera House, that you enjoy reading the book. If you do, please get in touch with me on Facebook or Instagram to let me know what you thought. I always love it when readers get in touch. So the Riviera House is out today. Happy reading, and thank you so much for spending the evening with